Is this the ideal monitor for those casual gamers out there who want something that's quite affordable? Today we're looking at the AOC Gaming Q27G4ZR, which sports a flat 27-inch IPS panel with a resolution of 1440p and a refresh rate that goes up to 260Hz. It also has support for HDR and also adaptive sync technologies. Now in this video, which has been sponsored by the manufacturer, I'll be covering everything you need to know about it so you can make your own informed purchasing decision. Now jumping straight in, I would like to point out that for you to achieve the maximum refresh rate and resolution, you'll have to be connected over the singular DisplayPort 1.4 input. Why? Because if you were to connect over the two HDMI 2.0 ports instead, you'll be capped at 1440p at 144Hz. Therefore, some food for thought. Now with that in mind, and with the monitor connected over DisplayPort to my RTX 3080, I went ahead and did my tests. And first off, when it came to the overall input lag, I was left really impressed. Yes, indeed, this monitor performed phenomenally well, even in a hardcore competitive game such as Counter-Strike 2. My mouse inputs were responding instantaneously on the monitor. However, it is also worth considering that the response time of the monitor is equally important. So let's actually dig into it. Now here, through the monitor's OSD, you've got a few different overdrive modes that you can select from. Off, fast, faster, and fastest. You've also got the extreme mode, however that is somewhat of a shortcut, and I'll be touching upon that further down in this video. Now here I did my test and started at the faster mode preset at 260Hz, which by the way is an overclockable refresh rate, which you can select via the monitor's OSD. And here you'll be able to see via the OS RTT tool that the average initial time, which translates to the average G to G, sat at 4.86 milliseconds. And disappointingly, the percent in window sat at roughly 47%. In other words, the monitor is not quite hitting the 260Hz refresh rate window. Now you can actually improve this and therefore better the experience by going on the fastest mode preset. The percent in window goes to a little bit of a higher respectable level of 67%, with the average initial time dropping down to 3.71 milliseconds. However, do note that towards the middle of your screen, you've got a bit more RGB overshoot. Just bear that in mind because we'll be touching upon that very soon. Now, as I downclocked the monitor to 240Hz, I actually found myself much more happy with the overall performance. Indeed, over here on the faster mode preset, you can see that the percent in window is far more respectable at 67%, while the average initial time is 4.23 milliseconds. So yes, indeed, this monitor does perform pretty well at 240Hz, at least for an LCD panel. Now yet again, on the fastest mode overdrive, you will be able to see that the percent in window and the average initial time both become better, where they go higher and lower respectively. However, you will also be able to notice that the RGB overshoot has got a lot more error. Now for me to give you a visual demonstration of this, you have got the UFO ghosting test. And while it might not be quite apparent that you've got quite a bit of inverse ghosting on its fastest mode overdrive, namely towards the lighter shades, I can say that while using this monitor in practice, I found that it was not really usable on its fastest mode overdrive. And as a result, I actually decided to using this monitor on the faster mode overdrive instead. And given the results that I've just shared in terms of the overall average initial time and also the percent in window that you can actually achieve, I would actually highly suggest running on the normal refresh rate of 240Hz, therefore ignoring the overclockable refresh rate of 260Hz. Now, through the UFO ghosting test, you will be also able to notice that there is an extreme mode overdrive. And yes, indeed, this is a shortcut of going on the fastest mode overdrive while enabling something called MBR, which stands for Motion Blur Reduction. It effectively gives you a much more clearer image, and it was perfectly demonstrated in the UFO ghosting test and equally when it came to using it in game. Now, I would suggest, however, that if you're going to want to use MBR, use the different level increments that you've got via the monitor's OSD, which go from 0 to all the way to 20, and then dial the overdrive to the faster mode preset. This will effectively give you a clearer image in terms of motion clarity, all while giving you no inverse ghosting because you're not having to rely on that fastest mode overdrive. Now, on the subject of MBR, it can also be used simultaneously with adaptive sync technologies, in other words AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync. This is thanks to a feature called MBR Sync, which you can select via the monitor's OSD. This will lock the brightness, but I did actually find it to be perfectly usable in a bright sunlit room, although those people gaming in a completely pitch black environment might find that the MBR sync brightness level is a little bit too bright for your liking. We'll touch upon brightness further down in this video. Now, it is worth highlighting over here that you have got an adaptive sync range from 48 up to 260 Hz. In my case, I've got an RTX 3080, and therefore when connected over DisplayPort, I had no flickering or black screen issues while running the NVIDIA Pendulum demo. Furthermore, I was able to run Destiny 2 at up to 260 Hz at 1440p with NVIDIA G-Sync enabled and also HDR. Now, the monitor has got Display HDR 400 certification, which is certainly appreciated. However, this does mean that the overall HDR image won't exactly look lifelike, but will give you a little bit of better color accuracy in comparison to, for example, using some of the other HDR modes that can be selected via the monitor's OSD. If you want my personal suggestion, it would be actually to use the monitor in SDR and therefore have full brightness and contrast controls to your own heart's desire. So next up we get onto console gaming, and as a reminder, you've not got any HDMI 2.1 ports, and as a result means that you cannot benefit from VRR over the HDMI input, which you'll be having to use over a modern day console. However, you will be pleased to know that you can output 1440p at up to 120 Hz. Of course, you can downscale it to 60 Hz or of course 1080p. Now, the overall performance of the monitor at 120 Hz was certainly impressive. On the faster mode overdrive, you can see that the percent in window sits pretty high at 93%, while the average initial time sits at a very respectable 4.01 milliseconds. Similarly over here at 60 Hz with the faster mode preset, which is again the one I would suggest, the percent in window is perfect at 100% and the average initial time sits at 3.94 milliseconds. In terms of the overall visual experience that you should be able to attain, here you can see that the faster mode is what I would suggest. However, you can see that there is also the extreme mode overdrive, which replicates the fastest mode overdrive that I did reference to before, and yes indeed there's quite a lot more inverse ghosting. Here it is also worth highlighting that MBR is available at 120 Hz, but is unsurprisingly not available at 60 Hz. So with the gaming section out of the way, let's get on to image quality. And here you have got a flat, matte-coated 27-inch IPS panel. I had no issues whatsoever when it came to the overall viewing angles and also text legibility. Now through the monitor's OSD, you have got a dedicated DCI-P3, panel native and sRGB modes. Concentrating on the latter, it's great to see that you've got full brightness controls. And here, using said mode and my calibrators, I noticed a gamut coverage of 93.3% and a gamut volume of 100.6%. Below you can see how it compares to the standards. The average delta sat at 1.49 and a maximum of 3.08. Closer to 0 is perfect, and this means this monitor can be used for some serious image editing work or video grading. The tested contrast ratio came in at a respectable 1150:1, with the measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target clocking in at 5935 Kelvin at 100%. As for the gamma curve, you'll be able to see how it compares to the 2.2 standards. Now, if you're not going to be working in the sRGB color space, you might want to unlock the wider color gamut of this monitor by going on the DCI-P3 or the panel native mode. I would suggest the latter because it actually will give you a little bit of extra pop on your image. Useful, for example, if you're watching movies or indeed gaming. So what about when it comes to brightness? Well, here surprisingly in HDR, I noticed a peak of only 432 nits. I say only because in SDR I noticed a higher brightness of 478 nits, and normally it's the other way round, but it wasn't the case with this monitor, further emphasizing the point that you might indeed want to use this monitor via SDR even if you have an HDR signal input available. Nonetheless, over here the monitor did get actually very bright, and therefore in a bright sunlit room I had to use it at roughly 60 to 70% brightness. While in a completely pitch black environment, the monitor does get relatively dim to 73 nits, although it might not be as dim as some people might want. As for the overall MBR level 20 and extreme mode brightness, which is going to be locked, here it went down to 77 nits. Now on the subject of peak lumens, we should also talk about brightness uniformity. And I do appreciate it is somewhat panel lottery, but here you'll be able to see how my tested panel performed across the board. And yes, there is a few errors towards the corners. Similarly here, when it came to durable backlight bleed, I found it to be perfectly acceptable. But of course your mileage may vary depending on the games that you're playing and indeed what you actually expect from the monitor at this sort of price point. So moving on from all these tests, I would like to talk about its overall build quality. And here you've got a 3-side bulbous design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. It's nice to see that little LED on the right hand side is not too bright and also doesn't mean it's going to distract you. As for the stand, it's great to see that it's actually relatively compact and gives you full ergonomic controls. It has got height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments. And it can even be rotated both ways, which is quite nice to see, specifically at this price point. Of course, if you do not want the relatively sturdy and built-in stand, you can replace it with a VESA compatible one, allowing you to place it on a multi-monitor setup or indeed a monitor arm. Now at the back of the monitor, you will notice that it's got a black and red finish to it. And yes, you haven't got those nonsensical RGB lights, which I'm all for. Now for you to adjust the monitor settings, they can be found via some physical buttons that are found at the bottom right hand side. And the monitor's OSD is actually very comprehensively laid out and provides you all the right options that you will desire. Furthermore, you've also got the AOC G menu software, which will provide you a further extension to this and give you some ease of use if you do not want to be accessing the monitor's hardware-based OSD. Here you will also notice that there is an audio setting. And yes, the monitor has got a 3.5mm jack output, which makes it handy for plugging in your headphones directly into the monitor, but you've also got some built-in speakers, which will suffice for your basic movie or gaming needs, or of course some Windows notifications. So there we have it. Hopefully you've enjoyed my detailed overview of the AOC Gaming Q27G4ZR. I'll be curious to know what you make of this relatively affordable 1440p monitor down in the comment section below and how you'd feel it compares to some of the alternatives. If you've enjoyed this video, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I hope you see you next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.